God and Country Radio program 288 is called A New Constitution. And in that program, I attempt to answer a question I have been asked quite often. If the U.S. Constitution is flawed, what would a new Christian Constitution look like? And what I would like to do in this session is review some of what I shared on the radio and then dig a little deeper. And I believe you're going to be surprised by my answer, but you're going to have to wait till the end of the program to get the full answer. Now, the reason I get this question is that in many of my programs, I point out that our current Constitution is not according to the Christian biblical view of government. It was a complete departure from the God-centered covenants that were written in the early colonies in the 1600s. The Constitution of 1787 was a product of the secular Enlightenment. It does have provisions for limited government and checks and balances. It was slightly influenced by the Christian theology of human depravity. But as far as the basis for law, our Constitution was man-centered, not God-centered. In the words of a 19th century Presbyterian theologian, James Thornwell, he said the following: "The Constitution of the United States was an attempt to realize the notion of popular freedom without the checks of aristocracy and a throne, and without the alliance of a national church. The concept was a noble one, but the execution was not commensurate with the design. The fundamental error of our fathers was that they accepted a partial for a complete statement of truth. They saw clearly the human side, that popular governments are offspring of popular will, and that rulers as servants and not the masters of their subjects are properly responsible for them, but they failed to apprehend the divine side. That all just government is ordained of God, and that magistrates are his ministers who must answer to him for the execution of their trust." Well said. Our Constitution, as it stands right now, is government without God. And for all of the mythological talk of our Constitution being such a Christian document, put together by men of faith, God is never mentioned. The law of God is never mentioned. And God's foundation for law and governance is never mentioned. At least in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, in order to satisfy the Christian right, made reference to the law of nature and nature's God. But even that didn't make it into our Constitution. So, someday we can be sure that our government will collapse. Because Jesus said every house built upon the rock of his word will stand. But every house not built upon his word is a house built upon sand. And it will collapse. And great will be the fall thereof. Matthew chapter 7, verse 27. The reason we have lasted so long as a country has not been because of our Constitution, but because of the Christian consensus that has operated on Christian common law. But when the day of collapse comes, whether it be in 50 or 100 years, if it is not the apocalypse itself, what kind of nation should we build out of the ashes? You're probably thinking, I'm not going to be around for that, so what difference does it make? Well, it is important because Christians must always hold before the world the ideal. I mean, we don't quit evangelizing simply because only a few people will be saved. And we don't quit teaching the doctrines of civil government simply because we live in a flawed government. But in the future, will the solution be to simply go back to the Constitution of 1787? Start all over again. I mean, after all, it worked pretty well for the first 200 years. But did it really? As I said, because of Christian culture, our Constitution was workable despite itself. But why should we go back to the very doctrine or document that put as the foundation of law equality and human freedom? The document that put the ethics of Baal worship on the same plane as the ethics of Jehovah worship. The document that became a club against the Christian faith. At the very least, we need to plug the holes that were in our first Constitution. Now, before we address the content of any new Constitution, I think we need to talk a little bit more about the problems in our current Constitution. The U.S. Constitution was ratified by the states in 1789. And most Americans think that our current Constitution was the first government after the Revolutionary War. But actually, it was our second government. Our first government was the Articles of Confederation, which the political class in America were not happy with because it didn't create a centralized, powerful federal government. So, rather than fixing the problems in the Articles of Confederation, a group of political men formed a Constitutional Congress in 1787, and they proposed an entirely new form of government. Now, at that time, many believed that these delegates at what's called the Constitutional Convention overstepped their authority. For the original charter for the convention was simply to revise the Articles of Confederation. In fact, it was not originally called the Constitutional Convention until after they proposed the new Constitution. Originally, it was simply called the Federal Convention. And also, by the way, all of the proceedings that took place over the summer of 1787 were kept secret from the public. Now, a friend of mine recently sent me a link to the Anti-Federalist Papers. Now, we know about the Federalist Papers, articles in a New York paper written by Hamilton, Madison, John Jay, that urged the states to pass the Constitution. Those articles explained the Constitution. But these Anti-Federalist Papers were articles written in papers to oppose the Constitution. And most people have never read the Anti-Federalist Papers. Most people are not even aware that there was opposition to our Constitution. Patrick Henry, the famous Christian statesman at the time, was one of the patriots who objected to the new Constitution. And his first objection was the opening line, "We the people." Henry and others believed that it should read, "We the states." Because the phrase, "we the people," was a way of getting around the authority of the states. This new government being proposed was the consolidation of all people under one federal government, rather than a confederation of independent states. So gone would be the check on federal power. And what the Anti-Federalists feared came about. The federal government overrode the Bills of Rights in every state. So that today, every state has to accept abortion. Every state has to accept homosexual marriage. Every state must prohibit the Bible from being taught in public education. And the states cannot, on their own, follow the laws of nature and nature's God. The Anti-Federalists also predicted that the judiciary, the federal courts, would someday become imperial. And that's come to pass. The Supreme Court tells us what the Constitution means. And the Anti-Federalists also feared that the federal government will be able to tax the people directly. And that came about in the creation of the federal income tax. But overall, the case against the Constitution made by these anti-federalists was rather weak. The theological ethical problems in the Constitution weren't even addressed. Now, in a recent email exchange with some friends, someone made the comment, where was I and another one of my friends in 1789 when we could have made a difference? But that question was really, where were the theologians? Where were the Christian leaders? Where were the Christian writers in 1788? Why weren't the Christians writing articles and papers pointing out where the Constitution needed revisions? So in that email circulation, I put forth 11 possible reasons why Christian leaders were silent. So if you will, get out a number 2 lead pencil and fill in the right circle. The question: Christian leaders in America did not object to the Constitution in 1788 because A, it was created in secret and ratified so quickly, few had time to respond. B, there were objections raised, but nobody wrote that history. And personally, I have read a few theological objections to the Constitution, but nothing really substantial until the 1800s. So Christians were a day late and a dollar short. C, Christian leaders were satisfied with the Constitution because it was all about the role of the federal government. The states could still establish religious values as the basis for law. The Constitution only became a secular club after it was applied to the states. D, the intellectual climate at this time, Locke, deism, were bulldozing over traditional voices. E, most colonial ministers weren't very educated in the doctrines of civil government. F, democracy or a representative republic had never been tried. And most colonial ministers believed it would be the answer. Hindsight is 20/20. G, the church has always responded to error rather than proactively nipping it into the bud. H, Christian leaders read the document, the Constitution, not through the eyes of an atheist, but through the eyes of a theist. They never considered how it could be read through the eyes of an atheist. For them, the non-establishment of religion did not mean a godless government. And remember Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 31. Anthropomorphically speaking, even God did not imagine that the Israelites would descend into the practice of child sacrifice, abortion. I, none of the above. J, all of the above. Or K, I don't know. Well, let me briefly explain two major problems with our U.S. Constitution. Of course, first, the absence of God. Not just the absence of God's name, but the failure to base law and justice on the revelation of God. And the historic Christian position is that government is to declare for Christ and declare itself to be under Christ. Government is not supposed to be secular, it's supposed to be godly. It's not as if the institution of the home or the institution of the church is to be under God, but the state gets a pass. And that the state can be independent of God and do anything it wants. According to Romans chapter 13, the magistrates of the state are to be God's servants, avengers against those who practice evil, and evil as defined by the law of God. And remember Isaiah 33:12. The Lord is our judge. The Lord is our lawgiver. The Lord is our king. And Psalm 9:17, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And particularly Jesus Christ, God come in human flesh, who is to be the king of every nation. Revelation 1:5, from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth. Now, before the 20th century, this was the prevailing view in all European nations in the previous 1500 years. That nations are to be Christian and they must declare for Christ and be under Christ. But then came the Enlightenment and humanism. And by 1787, political leaders began to believe that governments are social contracts made by men. God can be marginalized. So a nation under God and under His law did not work itself into our Constitution. And that was a fatal mistake. Jonathan Edwards, famous American theologian from the 1740s, wrote this: if a nation renounces the necessity of the Bible in her laws, that nation would soon become more absurd, brutish, and monstrous in its notions and practices than the heathen were before the gospel came among them. Edwards was somewhat prophetic there in his assessment, because even the American Indians did not practice abortion and homosexual marriage. And isn't that also what happened to ancient Israel? The Old Testament prophets wrote that Israel, in her latter days, became more evil than the Canaanites who were before them. So just realize that the absence of God from our Constitution is no small thing. It was a complete repudiation of Christian teaching. The second major mistake in our Constitution was the Bill of Rights. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive, because the states wanted the Bill of Rights to be included as a safeguard against tyrannical government. But actually, the Bill of Rights has become the basis for tyranny, in that our Constitution did not establish a true foundation for ethics, pointing legislators and judges to God's authority. The Bill of Rights in our Constitution has become our ethical guidebook. Now, Alexander Hamilton actually objected to the inclusion of the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. Quote, Hamilton writes, "I go further and affirm that bills of rights, in the sense and to the extent in which they are contended for, are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution, but would even be dangerous." See, Hamilton was afraid that by the Constitution delineating our rights, it would appear as if the government was granting our rights. And also, if we delineate 10 bills of rights, what about the hundreds of other rights? So, in short, the objection was that the Constitution would become a source of ethics and rights. And those few bills of rights could not be an adequate ethical guide. If there were no bills of rights or Bill of Rights, where would the courts go to find authority for moral decisions? I mean, we're so used to the courts today arguing over what the Constitution says. But if there was no Bill of Rights, where would they go? Well, they would go to where they had always gone, to the Scriptures, to transcendent religious and ethical morals. So then at least the battle over right and wrong would take place in the realm of transcendent ethics. But now judges and legislators believe ethical norms must be deduced from the Constitution. And the Constitution was never intended to be a source of morals. It's insufficient. It's incomplete. It doesn't really give us a basis for right and wrong. In fact, to go with the Constitution as a moral guide, as a basis for ethics, is to base ethics on personal freedom and equality. And that's absurd. But this is where we are in America. And many conservatives have fallen for the lie, saying that we must get back to the Constitution. Really? Exactly which ethic taught in the Constitution is going to save America? I could show you how a secularist using our Constitution could justify turning America into Sodom and Gomorrah or into Pompeii. Getting back to the Constitution will only justify more lawlessness based on personal freedom and libertarianism. So what we instead need to be teaching the people is that we need to get back to the original basis for law found in the early constitutions in the 1600s. God's natural and written law. Now, back to the main subject. What would a new constitution look like? It's kind of like a bad computer program that needs a patch. What would be included in the new code? Mark Levin has a book out called The Liberty Amendments. And yeah, I've got it right here. Just came out maybe a year or two ago. And he suggests 11 new amendments, which would include term limits, limits on federal spending, restoring the authority of the states, limiting federal bureaucracy, restoring private property rights. But from a Christian perspective, first, a new constitution would include something about the law of God and the law of God being the basis for law. Where law is not based upon equality or freedom or human utility, but where the Constitution would actually write out that law is derived from the law of nature and nature's God. As in the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639. So let me quote that. A government should be established according to God, and that magistrates shall have the power to administrate justice according to the laws herein established, and for want thereof, according to the rule of the word of God. Now, there is a movement today called theonomy, or it's often called Reconstructionism, that teaches Gentile nations ought to be under the Mosaic law. That the regulations of the Old Covenant are normative for all Gentile nations and for America today. But that would be the same mistake that some Christians fell into in New England in the 1600s. Now, I plan to do an upcoming program explaining the errors of Reconstructionism. But for now, let me just simply say that that position was never the historic Christian position of the Reformers. But a new constitution would actually have to spell that out. That the law is not going to be based upon the 613 laws of the Torah. And I would even borrow from John Calvin's Institute, where he wrote in his treatise on civil government, in section 16, that the law of Moses was a special school for the Jews. It was temporary. Some general principles can be drawn from the Mosaic case law, but it's not absolute. Quote, "The Lord did not deliver the law by the hand of Moses to be used in all countries and to be everywhere enforced. But having taken the Jewish nation under his special care, patronage, and guardianship, he was pleased to be especially its legislator. And as he became a wise legislator, he had special regard to it in enacting laws. So then, what is to be the basis for moral law? Well, what's called natural law. The universal laws of right and wrong, such as the Ten Commandments that were written on men's hearts even before the Mosaic Law was given. And so a new constitution would direct the courts to believe in God's universal natural laws rather than in relativism or in law positivism as put forth by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Now, of course, some basic laws need to be specified. Right to life, biblical marriage as established in Genesis. But one must be very careful in the wording. I have read some replacement constitutions put forth by Christians, which are absolutely horrible in their wording. It's like you're reading the 613 laws of the Torah. And that is not a biblical or a wise approach, so be careful of such proposals. So, the first inclusion in this new constitution would be the Christian worldview, a Christian view of law. Second, there would have to probably be some limits on campaign contributions and money in politics. This would be the application of a bribe corrupts justice from the book of Deuteronomy and Proverbs. Third, there would have to be some designated limits on the power of government. The various institutions ordained by God would need to be explained. That the state is not to do what the family is ordained to do, and the family is not ordained to do what the state is ordained to do. Fourth, there would have to be some explanation that voting does not mean a rule of the people. Now, I've heard that many claim that the Jews' decision at Mount Sinai to keep the law is a justification for democracy. But actually, the people were not making the law, they were just deciding whether to keep the law already given by God. It's very easy for people to take voting to mean that laws are determined by man. Fifth, in a new constitution, there would have to be some corrections concerning this concept of human rights. And many theologians have pointed out that the Bible doesn't speak in terms of human rights. The law of God addresses your duty from a negative point of view. Thou shalt not kill. There's something that's just not 100% true in this concept of looking at law as being human rights. But I'd have to leave that whole issue to men better than I. 6, there would have to be some allowances for separation from the union. We talk about checks and balances, but there are no checks and balances against the abuses of a runaway federal government unless the states have a right to separate from the union at any time. That's the best defense against tyranny. Evil is empowered by forcing unity. So those 6 points are not a comprehensive plan for a new constitution, but it's a start in explaining what a new constitution would look like. But now in closing, consider the following important points, and this is where we're going to get into some real important biblical theology. First, we have never really seen a nation on earth create a truly biblical government. It's been tried, even in Israel, but evil men have always entered and destroyed the whole process. Now, I'm not referring even to evil atheists. It's religious Pharisees and hypocrites who also destroy the work. A righteous government would not even last. Unregenerate men would try to ruin it in some new way. In fact, a new government system could actually be put together to cause people to behave themselves by instituting very harsh penalties, by expanding the death penalty against many crimes, against drug use, against adultery, against pornographers. And with that, you probably could build a lawful society. But the citizenship would be only outwardly obeying the law of God. Inwardly, it might be a very harsh society, and it might create dead formalism. And that's what happened in the days of Jesus. Because the law itself is not the source or the cause of good people. God gave to Israel extreme laws. But look what Israel did with those laws. And this was God's object lesson to the entire world. That as we read in Hebrews chapter 7 verse 19, the law makes nothing perfect. And yet today we still find people who are looking to laws and to government to make a perfect world. At the end of his life, George Washington said the following about the U.S. Constitution, and this is a great quote. "No compact or constitution of men can be pronounced everlasting and inviolable. And if I may so express myself, that no wall of words, no mount of parchment can be so formed as to stand against the sweeping torrent of boundless ambition on one side, aided by the sapping current of corrupt morals on the other." Unquote. See, Washington had grown in his understanding. And he had a much more realistic view of the purpose of government or the power of government. Now, this does not mean we don't try to create a good society. But we realize changing hearts by the power of the gospel needs to be primary. Second, it could be said that we really don't know for sure what a new constitution would look like because we're not too sure what polity of government would be best in every situation. We generally know what laws of God need to be included, but the form of government is a real mystery. Now, this is going to take a while to explain. But I'm going to go back here to John Calvin's treatise on civil government in section 8. He wrote something that most American patriots would disagree with. He wrote that the form of government depends on circumstances, or rather the character of the people. For some, the best form of government is an aristocracy. For others, an oligarchy. For others, a republic. To quote Calvin directly, "And certainly it were a very idle occupation for private men to discuss what would be the best form of polity in the place where they live, seeing these deliberations cannot have any influence in determining any public matter. Then the thing itself could not be defined absolutely without rashness, since the nature of the discussion depends on circumstances." See, this is the very thing that people today waste their time talking about. Which form of government is best? Calvin's saying here it's an idle occupation, a waste of time, because there is no one answer. It depends on circumstances. And then he goes on to explain that some sort of oligarchy, a rule by a group, is probably the best form, since God set up in Israel a rule by elders before Israel demanded a king. But then Calvin goes on to write, "And if you compare the different states with each other, without regard to circumstances, it is not easy to determine Which of these has the advantage in point of utility? So equal are the terms on which they meet. Monarchy is prone to tyranny. In aristocracy, again, the tendency is not less to the factions of a few, while in popular ascendancy, democracy, there is a strong tendency to sedition. Then Calvin goes on to defend godly liberty in general. And I will willingly admit that there is no kind of government happier than where liberty is framed with becoming moderation and duly constituted so as to be durable. So I deem them very happy who are permitted to enjoy that form of government. And I admit that they do nothing at variance with their duty when they strenuously and constantly labor to preserve and to maintain liberty. But should those to whom the Lord has assigned one form of government take it upon themselves anxiously to long for a change, the wish would not only be foolish and superfluous, but very pernicious. If you fix your eyes not on one state merely, but look around at the world, or at least direct your view to regions widely separated from each other, you will perceive that divine providence has not without good cause arranged that different countries should be governed by different forms of polity. For if it has pleased God to appoint kings over kingdoms, and senates over free states, whatever be the form which he has appointed in the places in which we live, our duty is to obey and to submit. The Arabs in the Middle East should have heeded Calvin's advice before they started the Arab Spring. Now, most Americans assume democracy is for everyone, and that democracy fixes all problems. But remember what John Adams said? Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So practically speaking, a constitutional republic has worked in America because we were a people weaned on 400 years of Protestant theology. But it will not work for a people weaned on a century of secular humanism. So we really don't know what a new constitution would look like, because the polity would have to fit the character of the people. And maybe someday the best form of government in America for a lawless people would be a monarchy. And God knows this. And I'm glad that God has not given Christians the opportunity to pick every form of government, because we probably mess things up. And consider also that in the plan of God, God actually at times wants there to be evil governments so that unsaved men would be taught, that they would get a taste of their own medicine. Not that we would choose such a government, but God allows evil men to choose these governments. Remember Matthew chapter 18, verse 7? Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks. For it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to that man through whom the stumbling blocks come. So we don't put the stumbling blocks of bad government before people. But when they happen, we accept them from the hand of God. Now let's look at some biblical examples. The first would be God ordaining that Israel and all of the surrounding nations submit to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. This would be Jeremiah chapter 27. Now I have given all of these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant. All nations shall serve him. And it will be that the nation or the kingdom which will not serve him, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and which will not put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, I will punish that nation with the sword, with famine, and with pestilence, declares the Lord, until I have destroyed it by his hand. Now, the false prophets in Jeremiah's day were saying, no, justice means we must fight against this tyrant, that we must maintain our freedom and the government polity we have here in Jerusalem. But these false prophets didn't appreciate that Israel had become so evil that the people needed to be under the control of a tyrant like Nebuchadnezzar. This was God's punishment. So if you were a Jewish patriot at this time, would you be telling the Jews to fight for the ideal government, where the citizenship has the maximum freedom? Would you be telling the Jews the words of Jefferson? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Or would you appreciate God's wisdom through the prophet Jeremiah that these people need a tyrant, a monarchy? What I found is that the Bible overturns the typical preconceived notions that people have about politics and governance. It overturns even the American mindset. Another example. In the wilderness wanderings, the Jews disobeyed God, and so God confined them to wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Certainly not an ideal situation. When the Jews realized the predicament they were in, they decided to work for a better state of affairs. And Moses said, no, God has spoken. Given your spiritual condition, you cannot have the promised land at this time. Nevertheless, they decided to invade the land of Canaan on their own. They were defeated. This is found in Numbers chapter 14. So here we see the difference between the perfect will of God and the will of God for sinners. And this applies to the difference between the perfect constitution made for a good people and a constitution that sinful people must instead live under. The final example is a prime example. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people come to Samuel and ask for a dictatorship. They want a king like all of the other nations. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. But this thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel, because the text will later go on to explain that God's plan for Israel was to be a theocracy, a rule by God as administrated by elders, rather than a rule by one man. And all of us would agree that a dictatorship is prone to trouble. Now Samuel goes on in the rest of this chapter to explain to the people that this king is not going to fight their battles. This king is going to enslave them. He's going to tax them to the nth degree. But in chapter 8, verse 6, Samuel prays to the Lord. And the Lord says to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. And then God himself gives to Israel King Saul. So here's the question. How could Samuel give them a form of government that was not the ideal form of government? Should not the prophet of God fight for the ideal system of a constitutional republic under God? And should not that ideal system be for all people? No. God gave them what they needed spiritually, even though it is not what we would call the perfect form of government. And yet it became the perfect form of government for them, given their spiritual condition. Now, one might assume that God would have told Samuel, listen, don't listen to the people. They need a theocratic republic. It's the one I gave them. That's the right form of government for all generations, for all classes of men. That's the best way to keep sin in check, and that will provide for the most righteous laws. But no, God said, given their sinful attitudes, they need a dictatorship that will best help them spiritually. And that's a real surprise. So what if we're living in a country when the Bolsheviks, the communist Bolsheviks, come to power? We just to roll over and let it happen and say, well, this is the will of God. No, we communicate what I have been communicating in this program. That the system you have chosen is not God's ideal system, but it might be exactly what you need, so you learn through the school of hard knocks. You see, Christians can speak against evil systems of government and yet at the same time be content and have peace. Don't fight to bring a society into the promised land when the promised land is not for that people. Now, here is one of the most problematic verses in the entire Old Testament. Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 25. God is speaking. I also gave them statutes that were not good and ordinances by which they could not live. What? I thought the law of Moses was supposed to be perfect and upright. How could this prophecy say that the Mosaic law was not good? Well, I believe the way we need to understand that verse is in the context of what I've been talking about here. That the law of Moses was God's allowance for a sinful people. But the perfect polity, the perfect constitution, is only found in the new covenant, the kingdom of Christ. So therefore, paradoxically, we can say that our current U.S. Constitution was not the will of God, but it was also the will of God. In other words, it wasn't the perfect will of God, but it was the will of God in regard to God's allowance for sinful men. It's what we needed. And God wanted America to undertake this experiment in godless democracy to teach the world a lesson. Now, a discouraging thing here is that when one tries to explain these truths to most people, they will look at you like deer in headlights. They have no idea what you're talking about. They can't even think in terms of the various wills of God. The prescriptive will of God, the determinative will of God, the sovereign will of God, or the will of His disposition. All they want to simply hear is, where do I put the bullets and where do I put the gunpowder? How do I keep tyrants from bothering us? But I trust that you will have wisdom and discernment in these things. Now, one final point. In my research, I have found it very fascinating that the church over the last 2,000 years has never been able to come up with a single coherent governmental system for every people group. Now, the immediate reason for this appears to be that we're not given enough information in the New Testament about how to create a government for the unsaved world. And again, this is why in Calvin's treatise on civil government, he never advocates for one form of government. But the implicit silence in Scripture may be the fact that the Scripture is saying to us that no government of men will work well for the unsaved. In other words, there is no system of laws or procedures that will completely bless or control unsaved individuals. You give them democracy, they're going to abuse it. And then they're going to need to go under a monarchy, but soon that'll become a tyranny, and they have to be relieved of that. And so the cycle goes around and around. The bottom line is there is no solution for unsaved people. There is no governmental system of man that can help man permanently, because the unsaved are dead in their trespasses and sins. They walk according to the course of this world, the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that's now working in the sons of disobedience. Ephesians 2. Romans 8, they're not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can they be. Or Ephesians chapter 4, they're alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that's in them. So the New Testament message is the only way to have a perfect government is for there to be perfect citizens. And that's the entire message of the New Testament. That men must be born again, become new creations, and become citizens of Christ's eternal kingdom, which will someday come to earth in the second coming and in the resurrection. Human government is merely a temporary patch that must constantly be changed. And this is why Christians are more concerned about preaching the gospel and making citizens for God's eternal kingdom than simply patching up the kingdoms of men. Jesus Christ, His salvation, His kingdom is the only answer. Thanks for taking the time to listen today. Thank you for making God and country a part of your discipleship. God bless.